Hi everyone, this is Amy from the CS Wash Fund. Could you just raise your hand if you can hear me, just to make sure that everyone can hear me properly? Excellent. It looks like most people have their hands raised. So welcome to today's webinar on civil society organisations learning for impact in the water, sanitation and hygiene sector. The webinar is around some research that has been commissioned by the Civil Society Wash Fund, or the CS Wash Fund, supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I'll just introduce you to the speakers today. Most of you know me. I'm the Program Coordinator for the CS Wash Fund, and the research was conducted by Melita Grant and Janina Murta from the Institute for Sustainable Futures, the University of Technology, Sydney, and they'll be taking you through the webinar today. I'll just quickly go through some points for the webinar, some guidance. If you wish to speak, just raise your hand. You can do that by pressing the hand icon in the attendees section, so you've probably all already done that at the beginning. If you have any questions, you can type them into the question bar and we can all see those questions and we'll attempt to answer them either right away or where it's maybe a little bit more relevant. If I could ask you to all make sure that you are muted, so clicking the mute button, just because if you're not muted then it causes a bit of feedback, it makes it a bit difficult to hear. Also, if you do have access to a USB headset, that also reduces feedback and will enhance your webinar experience. If you do experience any technical difficulties, please email the address on the screen there, CSWash, actually should be CS Wash Fund Online, at thepalladiumgroup.com, and I'll be monitoring that email address, and there's a help site there as well, but hopefully I won't have any technical issues. So just as a quick introduction, most of you will be quite aware of the CS Wash Fund, but through the CS Wash Fund, the Australian Aid Program is supporting 13 CSOs or NGOs to implement 29 projects in 19 countries, and this research is part of the knowledge and learning component of the CS Wash Fund. So the research was commissioned to address a recognised gap. The need for learning from practice and sharing these lessons is well known in the sector. What is not known is the best and most effective ways to share lessons, evidence and new knowledge so that others can also learn and improve programming. As we'll hear, the research has aimed to understand not only what tools and formats are preferred for learning, but also what are the most effective in influencing and improving the way things are done. So we do hope that you gain some insights from today's presentation that will help you with your work in WASH. We'll have some time for questions at the end, and the webinar will also be recorded and available on the CS Wash Fund website. So now I'll hand you over to Melita and Janina.
Thank you very much, Amy, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us, and it's great to see so many people in the attendees box there. We've got 19 people already, and I understand that quite a few more people will join us as we go. So lovely to meet you, and without further ado, we'll kick on with the presentation. So we'll just start with kind of asking that big picture question, why research learning within CSOs? And no one could say it better than Dr. Zeus, really. The more that you read, the more things you'll know. The more that you learn, the more places you'll go. So that's one perspective on why would we research learning in CSOs. But also, as well as going to more places, we also know that the association between effective knowledge management and business performance has been demonstrated in many studies, and there's quite a few empirical pieces of research which show that connection between human resources and ICT knowledge management and business's bottom line. So that's a really interesting emerging field. One of the things that leads to that improved bottom line is employee satisfaction and retention. We know that knowledge and learning aids innovation, and knowledge and learning supports evidence-based practice, which is very much the focus of this piece of research. So the CS Wash Fund set 3 research questions to define this piece of work. The first was, how do CSOs learn and improve WASH programming and practice to align with evidence-based approaches? What materials, formats and communications mechanisms are most preferred in influencing CSO learning? And what materials, formats and communication mechanisms are most effective and innovative in improving CSO WASH program in alignment with good practice? So the first part of this, the first question, really deals with what's happening within the CSO, the individuals, how they interact and how the organisation functions and the sort of organisational culture that supports learning. And that's shown with that maroon circle. And then the second 2 questions really look at what's happening between the CSO, civil society organisation, and their environment, other organisations from different types of organisations and other CSOs themselves. So question 2 and 3 will look more at that broader relationship and also the flows of information in and out of the CSO and what forms that information takes. Another quote from a well-known person in our history is Einstein, of course, and he said, "Pure logical thinking cannot yield us any knowledge of the empirical world. All knowledge of reality starts from experience and ends in it." So that's something that is quite interesting to reflect upon at the end of this presentation, given that the research we've conducted certainly supports that observation made such a long time ago. The big question is, though, what are the most effective ways of translating and transmitting this knowledge within the WASH sector? Quickly run you through the methodology that we undertook. We did a literature review of more than 50 academic and grey sources of literature. We then mapped that against the research questions and designed the survey questions from that mapping exercise. We did 2 surveys I'm sure you're familiar with because you probably filled one of them out, one for CSOs and one for other stakeholders, and that included donors, governments, think tanks and others. And we then interviewed in depth 14 civil society organisation representatives and 6 other stakeholders, and those other stakeholders had very close relationship with CSOs and have a great deal of experience in the area of knowledge and learning. And we received 60 responses from CSOs to the online survey, and 22 other stakeholders responded to the survey, bringing the grand total of over 100 WASH sector practitioners being involved in the research. We used the qualitative data we used Deduce rather to assess the qualitative data, which is a piece of software online which helps us code and analyse the qualitative data. So now moving on to the results. For the first question, as I said, we'll focus on how do CSOs learn and improve WASH programming and practice in line with evidence-based approaches. I'll answer that in relation to 3 key areas that we found were that emerged from the research. And the first is around individual learning styles, secondly around organisational culture, and thirdly around enablers. We asked people, how do you share information in your workplace? And not exactly surprisingly, people said emails, on-the-job meetings, and informal conversations. We then asked them, what are some of the most important sources of learning for you as an individual? And again, people identified on-the-job learning, discussions with their peers, and partnerships. So very interesting to see that these face-to-face experiential type learning modes were seen as very important to individuals when we asked them what really works for you. Then asked people to imagine a CSO that has a really strong learning culture, one that fosters knowledge and learning to a great extent. And we asked them to describe what kind of features it had. So we've then used them to identify what might be some of the some of the features of an ideal learning culture. These include time and financial resources dedicated to knowledge and learning, willingness to try new approaches. Sorry, I just have to move my chat box to be able to see this one. Leadership actively supporting learning. A proactive approach to partnerships. Reflection processes built in. Donor support for knowledge and learning. And a sense within the organisation that it's okay not to know. From the analysis of the qualitative and quantitative data, we identified 6 key learning enablers. And an enabler is simply a person or a thing that makes something possible. It's in this context understood to be when something is specifically focused on and deliberate attention is given to it or it's prioritised, then it will lead to a more successful learning culture within the WASH CSOs that we surveyed for this research. And these 6 I'm going to go into a little bit of detail around, but they are in brief. Firstly, opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, time for reflection processes, leadership driving a learning culture, knowledge and learning duties identified in work plans, time to engage with networks, and adequate resources, for instance, time and funding. So firstly, peer-to-peer learning. 68% of CSOs identified discussions within their organisations as being very important to their learning, and peer-to-peer learning was identified to be important in the areas of learning exchanges and events, attending conferences and workshops, annual summits, retreats, other organisations coming together to discuss lessons learned, learning visits and field visits. These are some of the examples of peer-to-peer learning that people gave us that they felt were extremely important to their learning. Time for reflection processes were also seen as critical, and some respondents noted that learning events and face-to-face workshops and conferences were particularly useful because they provided that critical reflection time that wasn't available during normal work hours. The interviews with CSOs and other WASH stakeholders revealed that learning from failure was an area, though, that could be improved on within organisations. A number of factors were identified that hinder some of the systematic use of failure in learning processes, and these included donor expectations, organisational reputation, fears of negative personal consequences resulting from admitting that things didn't go quite according to plan. But 77% of CSOs felt that monitoring evaluation reports are routinely analysed and used and built in and used in their learning processes. The non-CSO respondents, a few more percent felt that than CSOs felt that monitoring evaluation reports weren't as effectively used as they could be in developing learning and knowledge and learning within the organisation. But the difference there was 33% of CSOs felt that there was a fair bit of room for improvement, and non-CSOs, around 40%, felt that there was a lot of room of improvement around using monitoring evaluation in improving programming. Leadership was an area that was identified as being critical for developing a learning culture within the WASH sector. And leaders were identified both formally, for instance, the CEO and senior management, but also informally, so champions within the organisation. In response to our question, the statement rather, our leaders support and encourage a learning culture, 45% of CSOs strongly agreed with that statement. So almost half of those who responded said that they felt that their leaders strongly support and encourage a learning culture. But power dynamics and hierarchical structures don't seem to be a significant problem within the CSOs surveyed, with about 63% responding that those issues didn't hinder information flows and uptake within the organisation. And one quote that we have from one of the participants was, "Our CEO emphasises his support for transparency and accountability, but encourages learning from failure. When something doesn't go according to plan, it's managed without finger pointing." One example of leaders within an organisation was given to us where a PhD candidate is driving the dissemination of evidence-based materials and peer-reviewed journals within the organisation and setting up some systems to enable all staff to access that information. So that was an example given to us where a champion within the organisation, not necessarily at a senior management level, is really driving learning from that sort of source of knowledge. You'll probably be very familiar with Peter Senge, who pioneered the learning organisation concept and thinking, and he also identifies leaders as being critical to the learning organisation, the cultivation of the learning organisation, and said that leaders in learning organisations are responsible for building organisations where people are continually expanding their capabilities to shape their future. And the critical part about that statement is the agency that the individual has in their own learning, and that also taps into some other literature we reviewed for this research about people determining their own learning needs and driving that within their own jobs and their own organisations. Another area that is very helpful in developing a learning culture is having knowledge and learning duties specifically identified within work plans. And some of the ways that this can occur, of course, is courses and reading and alliances, members of alliances and presentations, conducting evaluations and using evaluations, conducting training, going to conferences, etc. And about 80% of our CSO respondents said that they had knowledge and learning duties identified in their work plans. 60% of them said that they had some funding for knowledge and learning, and 60% said that they chose their knowledge and learning opportunities. The WASH sector is very strong in terms of having some really well-supported networks and well-populated networks, and 65% of our respondents said they were part of a formal learning alliance or a community of practice. Some examples were given of some networks that people are members of and that they find are really supportive to their own learning, such as the CLTS Knowledge Hub and Susanna and WASH Reference Group and RWSN and others, and we've got a really nice list of those to use in the report and other outputs for this research. Time and funding is, of course, the a big issue that was raised quite often by our respondents, and a lot of people did come back to this concept that comes out of this kind of a quote, which is, "We're not stuck for resources, we're stuck for filtering and time." So the production of materials and more information, of course, needs to be accompanied by adequate time and funding to pursue opportunities and to have to read and to reflect. So that came through quite strongly. And we also found that having resources allocated to knowledge and learning overall for the organisation, but also at the project level, helps prioritise it. So some organisations reported that they have knowledge and learning identified within every project budget, and that makes sure that it is prioritised and it does have a place at that project level, but also at that higher level organisationally. Some organisations that have reviewed their own knowledge and learning needs have identified the need for an overarching knowledge and learning fund, and people could draw on that fund based on strategic needs of the organisation but also the individuals. And so having almost like a quarantine pool of funding for knowledge and learning activities will also give it more prominence and protect it to a large extent. The role of donors, of course, came up in this area, and many cited the importance of donors not only in providing funding for knowledge and learning activities, but for requiring it as part of the funding agreements, and that not only legitimizes it as an activity within the project itself, but also enables people to potentially share their results and their learnings to the wider community, because it is a condition, but also it's funding is provided for it. And the DFAT and the Gates Foundation were specifically mentioned as driving knowledge and learning within the donor community. Okay, well, I'm now going to hand over to Janina, and then once we've talked about some of the questions 2 and 3, then we'll have time for your questions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Janina now. So moving on to addressing research questions 2 and 3. So the first research question dealt with what's happening within CSOs, as Melita explained before, so how CSOs learn and improve practice. And these two other research questions, they look at effective communication mechanisms. So if you're going to design knowledge and learning projects targeted at CSOs, what are the best formats for doing that? So we asked people what types of communication they preferred, but also what types of communication they perceived had led to the greatest level of improved practice within the organizations. So we're looking at the outer circle in this diagram. So if you look at this graph, you can see that face-to-face formats like conferences and presentations and face-to-face networking events were rated quite high as a preferred type of communication, and so were other traditional forms of communication like reports and working papers, fact sheets and case studies, toolkits and training materials, manuals, field guides and how-to guidance notes, and briefing and policy notes. But if you look at the next diagram, the next graph, what you can see is that actually, so this graph looks at how much different types of communication were perceived to have led to the greatest level of improved practice within the organizations. And you can see that face-to-face formats and materials that provide some kind of practical guidance, so manuals, field guides, and how-to guidance notes, and toolkits and training materials. There's a higher proportion of respondents who said they led to a lot of improvement compared to a lower proportion of respondents on fact sheets and case studies, reports and working papers and briefing and policy notes. So clearly there was a preference for face-to-face formats and guidance materials, and this also came through very clearly through the in-depth interviews. And one of the reasons behind this preference relates to the time constraints of CSO staff, like Melita mentioned before. So there's limitations in terms of times for staff to dedicate to reading and learning. And so things like learning events free people from this constraint for a period of time. And like one respondent said, it forces people to learn because there's nothing else to do. Another aspect is that face-to-face formats like learning events, they allow for peer-to-peer learning opportunities, which we saw earlier in the presentation was a key enabler for organizational learning. And they also provide opportunities for discussions and partnerships, which you also saw earlier in the presentation. That it was one that came through as a preferred source of learning. So in terms of the types of communication that were least preferred, you can see that web-based formats such as webinars and massive open online courses, they were rated quite low. and this may be related to slow internet connection in a lot of developing countries, and the suggested way around this was to record these events and make them available for download at a later time. And unsurprisingly, peer-reviewed literature also came out as a low preference, but there was one CSO who actually was trying to push this internally so that there was a greater use of this type of publication within an organization as a way to inform the design of their programs and being able to actually claim that their programs were evidence-based. So clearly CSO staff want face-to-face formats and tools and practical guidance, but it was pointed out that a typical pitfall happens when these tools and practical guidance offered at learning events, for example, they then need to be adapted and localized to a specific context. And this disaligns with findings from another piece of research in this space of CSO learning from another organization, the Results for Development, which says that often what CSOs miss is mentoring support or someone to reach back for questions and assistance in using these tools and the skills learned at learning events and implement them in their own local specific contexts. So we also try to understand what types of communication materials and knowledge and learning products CSOs were producing to disseminate their lessons. And we found that there were different approaches to publications and the production of these products. So some CSOs, they didn't see themselves as knowledge producers. They saw that the role of that role of producing knowledge was of other CSOs, like for example Oxfam or WaterAid, and they regarded themselves more as implementers of projects. And I guess the so what of this is that these CSOs, they may not see themselves as knowledge producers, but for sure they are learning along the way, and so they are knowledge holders. So the question is, how are they capturing what they learn and sharing that back with the sector beyond their own organizations? We asked people to give examples of good knowledge and learning products and to characterize this, and you can see in the Wordle that again tools, guidance and practical came out as strong, very strongly as one of the main characteristics of a good knowledge and learning product. But other characteristics included well written and easy to read, short, concise and summarized, that it contains images and infographics, that it's easy to access and share, for example, easy to download, cheap, also that is well referenced or based on evidence or at least from a trusted source, that provides resources for future research, and it was also pointed out well-curated material. So, and this relates with what Melita said earlier with a quote that we're not stuck for resources, we're stuck for filtering and time. So often CSOs are exposed to so much information out there that actually a challenge they are faced with is to then filter down to their specific needs. So having a platform that does that for them would be something beneficial. So in this slide we have two examples of good knowledge and learning products that were mentioned quite a lot. So one of them was the field guide by IDEO, which has a very strong design background, and so this resource is visually quite attractive, which matches the criteria, the characteristics that people presented, used to describe good knowledge and learning products. And the other one was the UNICEF Sanitation Marketing Learning Series. They were also mentioned quite often. These resources, they're quite text heavy, but they do focus on practical guidance, which, as I mentioned before, came through as one of the top characteristics of good knowledge and learning products. So I'm going to hand over to Melita to go through the take-home messages.
Thanks, Janina. Yes, we had a lot of take-home messages, but we've managed to distill them down to 6. But feel free to look at the longer report that will be available soon for more. But some of the big ones are, for those CSOs developing a learning culture, leadership is obviously very important in setting the scene and prioritising learning and knowledge and learning within the organisation, allocating resources and giving a sense of legitimacy to knowledge and learning activities. Resources are of course important, and it's important for them to be actively identified and budgeted at that higher organisational level, but also project by project. And how that translates into work plans is also critical. And donors, of course, play a very important role, not only in providing funding and requiring knowledge and learning as part of a particular funding agreement, but also in allowing for reporting processes to be flexible enough to account for learning from failure or learning from when things change, and also providing an open and safe space for that kind of learning to be understood mutually and to be discussed. For CSOs themselves who are producing materials, we've seen that traditional forms of guidance materials are still relevant. So you've got your case studies and fact sheets and guidance materials and toolkits. They still seem to be quite popular. And that face-to-face learning is particularly valued within the organisation itself, not only learning from peers and colleagues, but also those events, learning events and conferences and reflection, annual reflection processes and times where people come together specifically to talk about what we know and how we can improve. And then just finally, with guidance materials, as Janina just talked about, they are preferred as one of the forms of materials of communication products, but they do need to be supported and contextualised. So support translating that into each context and into the field is necessary. So thank you very much for listening to us talk about the results of the research, and we're really looking forward to having discussion now with you, and also at the WASH conference if you're there. And here are our email addresses in case we don't get to all the questions today and you want to ask anything at all or want to continue the conversation with us. So now what we'll do is, if you'd like to write any questions you have in the questions or chat box, then Janina and I will keep an eye on those and then let the whole group know what questions are being asked and then respond to them. Okay. Thank you for that very positive feedback that we just received there. I might just check with Amy to see if you can see more questions that we can't at this stage. We're just getting a bit familiar with the technology.
I think we can probably see the same, but you can also unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question rather than type it.
That's right. And while people are thinking of their questions, I guess a question that we have to this group is, what do you think about the the kind of enablers that this research found, the things that really do support and assist a knowledge and learning culture? And is there anything else from your own organisation that you find really helps drive learning within your organisation? I'll just pick up some of the housekeeping questions here so that we can, so everyone hears. So we have a question about, will the webinar be available on the CS Wash Fund website? And yes, it will be recorded and it will be available on the website, which is lucky because, as we said, one of the findings was that webinars are great, but sometimes they're not accessible to everybody, and so it's important to record them and have them available for people at a later time in a different time zone and also with different internet speeds. Yes, Elizabeth, thank you for asking about Susanna. People did mention Susanna as a source of learning, and we had quite a few people mention various networks that they're a part of. And we would need to do some more in-depth discussion and talking to people who are members of networks to really get a deeper understanding of what it is that those networks provide that supports learning. But I think the general principles that this research has identified around peer-to-peer learning really speaks to the importance of networks. One CSO did talk about a network where they were able to ask about technical issues. So, for instance, we need some designs for disability accessible toilets, and within 24 hours they've got designs being emailed around the network and things like that. So there's some really great examples of technical network sources of learning, but Susanna was certainly mentioned, and this research was promoted on Susanna. Thank you very much for Ranganathan for talking about the, from Plan, the use of materials in the WASH project, and that's helped you be a leader in the sector of school WASH. And we have a question around what organisations did to gain support from their leaders to support this particular learning culture. Now that's a great question, digging in deeper around how you manage up or gain the support of your leaders. The examples that I heard, it actually seemed to come more from the leaders themselves than the staff trying to summon that from their lead, or influence their leaders. But that's a great question for us too. We can look back at the data with that lens and see if anything particularly came out around that and get back to you. Tom's asked a question around disaggregation of the respondent types and how that influences preferences and uses for knowledge and learning. Yes, we have disaggregation around geography, size of organisation, and the type of organisation, and the role of the respondent. And so we could easily cut the questions around that disaggregation and look at the differences between them. The only issues that with 60 responses from CSOs, disaggregating it, and 20 from non-CSOs, disaggregating it means you're starting to get quite small groups, and so the reliability of that is not as strong. But we could definitely have a bit more of a look to see if there's anything that came through.
Yeah, I'll just add a point on that. That actually from the respondents on the CSO respondents to the survey, they were a bit heavier on the more sort of senior roles. So yeah, that's just something to note.
Yeah, more senior roles came through with the CSO responses. We have a question around what are the key areas where other stakeholders and CSOs had different views about CSO learning from Juliet. Now this one, for me, the strongest area was probably the use of monitoring evaluation data and also the ability for CSOs to own and use some of the baseline studies and the data that comes out of baseline. So the issue came up around using consultants for some parts of monitoring evaluation, especially baselines, and then how that data is used within the organisation, and sometimes the risk is that knowledge is outsourced and that it stays outside of the organisation. So my analysis of the in-depth interviews particularly was around this use of monitoring evaluation data, CSOs feeling that it was used effectively to inform programming, knowledge and learning to a slightly greater extent than non-CSOs felt it was used. That's one thing that comes to mind, and what we'll do as well is just reflect on that question a little bit more and see if anything else particularly came through. Elizabeth's asked, is learning within CSOs fundamentally different to learning within other types of organisations? That's a great question in light of the literature review we did, Elizabeth, and we haven't seen this kind of research done in different sectors actually. So even though we did a lot of research around learning organisational culture more generally, this kind of very sectoral focused piece of research is quite unique to the WASH sector. And so what we were seeing was a consistency with the findings that we got from the CSO and other stakeholder participants and the literature itself. So that's heartening, and the literature around more broad, it's very business oriented, corporate, I guess business practices oriented, a lot of the literature, but a lot of what we found does actually mirror the broader understanding of knowledge and learning practices within organisations. Catherine's said, great research, any suggestions for the structure of an organisation to maximise the empowerment of staff and transfer of knowledge between staff, government and research? For instance, prioritising topics, one per year, or some practical ideas of where to focus your energies and resources. We did, just quickly on that topic, on that issue of topics, we did ask our CSOs and non-CSOs what WASH topics they felt needed the most knowledge and learning, and that data will come through in the resources that we produced out of this research. And functionality of WASH infrastructure was an area that really came through from CSOs and non-CSOs as an area that really needed more knowledge and learning time resources put towards it, and also monitoring evaluation came through for both of them.
So just actually on the question of if there was any differences between answers from CSOs and non-CSOs. So we did capture in the research aspects around the content of learning needs. And so both CSOs and non-CSO respondents, they emphasized the need for learning needs around functionality and service sustainability and monitoring evaluation of WASH. But in addition to that, non-CSO survey respondents, they also highlighted that CSOs have learning needs around engaging local government, equity in WASH, and also market-based approaches. And these didn't come through the responses from CSOs. So that's a bit of a difference in terms of responses from these two different types of respondents.
Great, that's a nice linking of those two questions. I think that's a great question that you've asked around the practical steps that now flow from within the examples, we asked respondents things like, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And a lot of those one things are very practical examples, and it's everything from CSOs themselves would conduct baseline studies through to leaders would be more engaged and more supportive of knowledge and learning, so you've got some of those higher level messages. Just looking back quickly at, oh yes, Elizabeth said it would be good if everyone can see the questions of everyone else. At the moment they only get visible once you make them green. We will look into that, Elizabeth. I'm sorry, the technical side of this is not my strength, so I will repeat people's questions verbatim. I didn't realise you couldn't read them. I'm very sorry. Okay. We've got a comment from Juliet here around the filtering idea, and she said it's interesting and important. Do you think this is something that each organisation needs to do for itself, or are there ways that this function can be facilitated? Perhaps that's part of what networks can and do provide. Yes, certainly I think that is what networks can and do provide, especially around D groups where you've got a specific topic and then people start to pepper that D group with examples of resources. An example being the RWSN D group last year on equity and inclusion, and everybody in the D group was asked to provide examples of resources, guidance materials that related to that particular topic, and they were compiled in an annotated bibliography and then provided back out to the network. So that was a really great resource that D group provided all the WASH participants. We now have a document that compiles a huge and relevant number of resources on that topic. Some people did talk about needing a global focus point for all resources. I think some people find that having to go to 5 different places or however many different places can be challenging given the time issues. As to how some sort of centralised repository of all materials would work, that's another question. But I think there is a bit of sense that information is scattered across a huge number of platforms. But having said that, donors do identify that they will want to get their resources from trusted source, from places that they feel are trusted, such as the World Bank and others. So yes, there could be a role for some sort of centralised database type function to bring everything together, but it would be quite a big piece of work. I didn't get enough data on that topic to be able to say the evidence would point to X, Y, Z. That's something we'd have to delve into more detail around, that sort of concept. Thanks, Elizabeth. Catherine has talked about maximising transfer of knowledge between staff, national governments, counterparts and research. It's related to an earlier question, and that is an extension of her question around what are some specific and concrete ways that organisations can do that. I think the best way to answer a question like that would be for us to, we've now got a really great group of CSO respondents and people that have signed up for this webinar and others who are very interested in this topic, and that becomes almost like a brains trust to ask these sorts of questions. I don't have examples of that particularly from the research, but that is certainly a question that we could put to the network at large, and if anyone wants to, in the chat box, give an example of where or how they've maximised that transfer of knowledge between, say, a learning alliance. That a learning alliance would be an example of those sorts of actors coming together. You've got your government, research institutions, staff actively coming together to learn and share knowledge experientially. So that would probably be the best practical example I could give to respond to that question at this point. But yeah, we'll do some more thinking on that one and maybe ask the network at large.
Just responding to Juliet's question in relation to whether there's any good examples of how CSOs conducted effective reflection processes. There were a couple of CSOs who mentioned having regular meetings at different levels within the organization, and one of the purposes of those meetings was to reflect, but a kind of reflection that happens in real time at the meeting. So there were situations where if it's a project team level, then they will reflect on previous projects and then what can they learn from previous experience to take that to the new project. And then there were other types of meetings at a different level, a more senior level, and that kind of reflection also happened. So there were a few CSOs that had those kind of meetings happening regularly.
Dorman's asked a question around economic calculation to measure the impact of the involvement of the CSO in WASH programs compared to one without CSO's involvement. I'm sorry we don't have anything on that. It's not quite related, as I can read, to knowledge and learning, but on that broader question of economic impact on CSO's performance, or the actual benefits of a WASH program and the attribution of knowledge and learning to that. That's not an area that we've found any empirical evidence around, but as I said, in the business world, there have been attempts made to actually calculate the benefit of knowledge and learning, both from an IT and also human resources perspective, and have found it to be economically beneficial for that organisation. I know that's not what you were asking, but I thought I would slightly reinterpret your question around this topic. Do let me know if there was something else that you wanted to ask Dorman about knowledge and learning there.
To Naomi's question, if the focus on WASH functionality was about technical aspects or governance, was more on the governance, because this was a question that we had in the survey. So it's they had to select options, and it was framed as functionality of the service provision.
And Naomi's also made a comment here around the value of networks playing a role in filtering that rests on having strong facilitation, and that networks need discussions, when done really well, are really valuable. So thanks for that insight. Paul has asked, how useful did people find daily or regular summaries of particular topics, for example, sanitation updates? Sanitation updates did feature quite often in people identifying networks or sources of information that they trusted and they liked and used. Definitely that came through. Anything else around? Janina has a lot of experience in these e-discussions and developing these sort of summaries of e-discussions. Did anything else come through in the interviews that you did around that? It's okay, we can have a think about that one, but certainly the sanitation updates did come through. And Biplab has asked, how can we prepare a good case study on WASH interventions? I think the slide that we showed previously, this one, the word cloud, really gives a few sort of high-level, I'm just trying to find it for you, ideas about what to really focus on with your case studies, and especially around, oh, can't see it. Is that it, the word cloud? There you go. Sorry, I just couldn't see it under my screen. Certainly around it being practical and evidence-based and have a lot of guidance, well summarised, short, relatively short. I know these are quite high-level pointers, but that's what came through from the research. Now, we've actually gone a little bit over time, I believe. Oh no, we're just, sorry, a couple of minutes before, and then we'll wrap up.
Just picking up on that point of the e-discussions that you were raising, I think Melita and I were having a discussion just before, and so if you look at that diagram, can you just put that on the diagram?
Oh, which one? The one before?
No, this one, on the preferred formats. Yeah, so you'll see that the groups and the discussions, they came as low in terms of preferences. We didn't investigate why these choices. So the reasons behind some of these choices, we have some possible reasons that came through the in-depth interviews, but there's nothing really that came through to explain this low preference for D groups and D discussions. But from my own experience, I think that often what happens with D groups and D discussions, it's a different type of format, because you don't know what's going to come out. You don't know if the content is going to be good or not. So I think the framing is a little bit more open and less clear whether it's the time investment is worth or not. So when you engage in these kind of formats, it's a completely different. It's different from the other types of formats where you have a clearer understanding what you're going to get out of it.
Yes, and there's a really interesting comment from Celia here saying, I personally find webinars and web-based forums to be a great leveler for knowledge and learning. Often overseas conferences and visits are seen as rewards or professional validation. This means that the most appropriate participant is not always chosen to attend. With webinars, it throws open knowledge and learning to many more participants, and certainly to those that are interested to learn or share about a certain topic. And that's a really great comment, Selena, that we also heard other people speak to around who gets to attend certain knowledge and learning activities, forums, conferences, and the more expensive ones are therefore obviously limited to a smaller number of people. And one of the practical, I guess, recommendations from a couple of participants was that more opportunities should be given to field staff and people that often perhaps miss out on the big conferences and the international meets because they're not in management or they're not at headquarters. So I think that the who part of the equation, not only the what, but who gets to engage with these different formats and how they get to engage with them is a really interesting question, and one that we've got a little bit of data on, but it's certainly we could go further with that. And Elizabeth has asked, could we please post the recording and also the survey results and the material that comes out of this research on the Susanna Forum? And yes, we definitely will, and thank you for that prompt and also for being so interested. We've now come to 4 o'clock, everybody, and I know that we haven't answered every single question, but I think we will leave it there, and what we'll do is we'll go through these questions, and we have your email addresses, so if you're happy for us to send an email to you if we didn't get to answer your question, just with a little brief response or a link to some information, then that's the way that we'll answer the last couple of questions that we didn't get to. but also you've got our email addresses at the end there. Sorry, bit trigger happy. And so do feel free to email any of us and we'll get the right person to respond to you if you do have any more questions. So what we'll be producing now is a short visually engaging document that will come out in the next couple of months. We'll also be presenting at the WASH conference this presentation, and we'll be taking your questions into consideration when we do this presentation again. So thank you for your input and your questions. And if we think of any more examples, especially around that question of practical examples, we'll let you know what came out of the research. But I think in terms of the general themes, the people have spoken, and I think it's a very interesting piece of research that can guide our work within CSOs, but also as donors and research organisations and people in the broader sector. And we can all play our part in championing knowledge and learning within our organisations. So thank you very, very much everybody for being part of today and joining us during this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at various events and online soon. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.